Welcome back to the Smooth Brain Society. I am Sahir, and with me again is Olivia.
Hello.
I will say a quote. You need to judge me on my German pronunciation. Okay. Fürchte nicht das Chaos, denn im Chaos wird das Neue geboren.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yes. And I should probably know who said that, but I don't know. Yeah, but it's very well pronounced also.
That was Carl Jung.
Carl Jung.
Carl Jung.
Yeah.
Could you translate it for people?
Yes, of course. Don't be afraid of the chaos, because out of the chaos, new things are born.
There we go. So you've heard her voice. Just a quick background of Associate Professor Hedwig. In a past life, she said she would have been a great viola player or even potentially a baker. However, in this one, Associate Professor Eisenbarth received her PhD and clinical training at the University of Würzburg, Germany, after which she worked at the Department of Forensic Psychiatry at the University of Regensburg, and the Clinical Neuroscience Department at the University of Colorado Boulder, before setting up the Affective and Criminal Neuroscience Lab at the University of Southampton. In 2018, she moved to New Zealand, and her lab at Victoria University of Wellington investigates emotional cues and how these processes influence our interpersonal behavior using psychophysiological methods. She is here today with us to talk about psychopathy and her research. So welcome, Associate Professor Eisenbarth.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. That's very interesting to talk about the research in such a context. I'm excited.
Did you want to give a bit of a background in how you got into what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I think if I start way back, why did I start psychology? Well, that's maybe I don't need to probably do that, but
I think that could be cool.
Everybody has their little story, right? As do I. So it was in high school that I had 10th grade, probably 16 or something. No, 15. There was a girl in our class who had suffered from mental health problems, and it was actually the first time that I was that close to somebody with something like that. And then I visited her she was actually in a child and adolescent psychiatry for a while, and I visited her there and was really struck by the symptoms and things that children and adolescents there showed. And I just did not even know that those things exist and that people experience these things. And I just wanted to know more about it. And then from then on, got really interested into psychology, learned that there's also stats involved and math, and which made me happy. So then I was studying psychology mainly with the classical goal of I want to be a counselor, clinical psychologist. And then midway through, I started doing internships with various places and met somebody who was a clinical psychologist in a forensic psychiatry and was totally fascinated. So this whole merging of mental health problems and then also behaviors such as criminal behavior, violent behavior that we consider as delinquent or just not contributing positively to society, but this link to mental health problems. So the idea that some people might commit a crime in the context of this mental health condition. And so then that got me totally interested in that. Did a couple more internships with the police and also with a professor at the university where I was at the time. He was doing something completely different that was about child care, basically. So if children should stay with mom or dad when there was a separation going on, and he was doing court expertise basically for that kind of cases, scenarios, so the guardianship. And so that gave me this whole big picture about forensic psychology. And I got also at the same time quite fascinated about facial expression, decoding or understanding and reading. And then one of my lecturers bring it up that it would be interesting to look into psychopathy in the context of emotion processing, facial expression processing. And at that point, I was done with my diploma. That's kind of a master's equivalent. And I thought, well, if he thinks I could maybe try a PhD, maybe I'm going to try that just for a little bit. And then I go back to clinical or psychology. But I ended up not doing that PhD. And then during that also clinical training, because I still wanted to have both options. And also this learning from the clinical work. And it is such an enriching other way of working in the field of psychology, definitely. And I miss it now because I don't do any clinical practice, but it was really, really good training and very important to inform research as well, to know what this client's side and view is. And and after the PhD, I did probably more like a lecturer position in the forensic psychiatry department. Continued to work mainly on psychopathy, but also started to work a little bit on sexual sadism. Had some interest there in sexual preferences. And then after a while, I thought I need to learn more methods. I want to also know how to do fMRI and advanced statistics stuff, and was very, very lucky to be able to go to Boulder, Colorado to work with Tor Wager, who's now in Dartmouth College. And he's one of the meta-analysis gurus for fMRI research, and also, of course, fMRI research itself. And he's working mainly on pain, and so I did actually work on a pain project there, totally different from what I did before. But it was very helpful to actually use a different context to learn a method, and also the analysis side of using machine learning techniques to understand data better. Not better, but in a different way than what we're used to with regressions and the other things that we do.
Might need to get someone on to talk purely about machine learning at some point.
Yeah, that'd be very interesting.
Yeah, I can recommend some people.
That's great. Well, let's get to your actual research work then. What is your current research like?
Yeah, it's funny how that is still linking back to these very first things that made me interested in it. So there's this one study that was using classical conditioning with facial expressions to see if people who are high and those comparison to low on psychopathy, so on these psychopathic traits, would vary in the way that they learn from combining a previously neutral stimulus, so something that hasn't had any emotional valence, with something negative like an electrical shock. So if you do that over time, if you show a facial expression that is neutral over time again and again paired with an electrical shock, what happens is that people basically transfer that valence from that electrical shock over to that face. So at some point, if you stop giving that electrical shock, people would have a similar reaction to that face that they would show usually to electrical shocks, like a startle, for example. So they react physiologically. You would see that in a skin conductance change, so they're more sweating, or also with a contraction of the eye muscle. So there's different ways. It's kind of a defensive mechanism. So this loud noise or electrical shock just produces such a reaction in everybody. And so what this study that I came across back then was doing, or showing basically in a few people, but that people who were higher on these psychopathic traits, they did not learn this association. So no matter how long they were exposed to the electrical shock together with this neutral face, they did not make this association. So they didn't learn it. But this was only true for negative association, so an electrical shock. And in other studies that have used other methods, it has been found that for positive stimuli, there's not such learning difference, or not like a lower responsiveness or anything like that. So this kind of was the grounds for the fear deficit hypothesis for psychopathy.
Mm-hmm.
Let's wind back a little bit. Could you explain to us what psychopathy is, or what defines it?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of debate around that. Ask 10 psychopathy researchers and they will say, well, there will be some overlap, but there's a lot of differences there as well. The funny thing is about psychopathy, many people have some preconceptions. They think that it's somebody who is showing a lot of violent behavior iteratively, so the serial killer kind of standard or so. It's not necessarily the case, and it's not the description. It's not like a definition part of it. People who are high in psychopathy, they are remorseless. They're low on an emotional intensity. So they would show emotional reactions, but they're just not long-lasting, and they are not very responsive to other people's emotions. They care a lot about their own goals and their own motivation and focus on that very, very strongly. and don't feel responsible for other people in their environment. That's their family, their co-workers, or their employees. So they just care less about people in their environment. And if you hear those descriptions and this egocentricity combined with low emotion and also some impulsivity, so poor behavior control, really, you can envision that somebody who has these characteristics would also be prone to commit crimes. And that's actually what has been found quite a lot in studying a lot of people who have been imprisoned, that there's a strong association between criminal behavior, broadest criminal behavior, so not only showing one type of criminal behavior, but also different types. So, for example, not only being violent, but also committing drug offenses or committing other types of offenses. And that people who are high on psychopathy and have been committing crimes before, they show an increased likelihood to commit crimes again. And that gives psychopathy that reputation, that a large body of research has been focusing on people who are imprisoned and men who are imprisoned also. So a lot of the literature circles around that. And that's where the reputation comes from for psychopathy being associated with criminal behavior, a male criminal behavior showing person. So, but it's actually going a little bit beyond that, because these behavioral effects, you could almost say, of that personality, of those characteristics, do not necessarily need to show in an antisocial behavior as in criminal or illegal behavior. So some people are just mean to their wife or mean to their employees. They just, for example, let off people as a CEO or without caring about them. They might do antisocial things in just a different way, where it's not about illegal behavior, but more like around the back. And in children, it's also mobbing, so this kind of betraying others. So things that are not necessarily that antisocial, but they still would show that type of behavior. And also for the sake of showing that behavior, so not necessarily to gain something, which is the usual thing, but more for the fun of it almost. And also lying for the fun of it. So more like, can I make people believe something that actually didn't happen? So and if I say they, I mean people who score high on psychopathy. They would love to see that they're effective in making somebody believe something and then shocking them and see the reactions and these kind of things. So this manipulative side is there as well. So where it's about manipulating somebody to believe something or to do something that they want to get.
So just to clarify, it's not viewed as like a category. It's just people who are high on these traits.
Yeah, so I use that phrasing on purpose, even if it has a couple more words. It takes longer to say somebody who's high on psychopathy rather than a psychopath. But the reason for that is that we do know from quite a lot of studies now that psychopathy is not a taxon, what we would call that. A taxon is like when you have a categorical difference between somebody who has it or has not. And I think there's only a few things left because we know that depression, schizophrenia, all these mental health problems that we've thought in the past are a taxon. So you either have it or you don't, are also dimensional. But we do definitely know for personality traits and personality disorder related traits that those are dimensional. So it's not like you have, there's a switch and all of a sudden you're a psychopath, and if you have 2 points less on a score on a scale, then you're not. It's a dimension, and it's also not a disorder. So it's not a disorder by definition of DSM, as in it's not listed in there. You could say the criteria to make some traits a disorder apply to psychopathy as well, because that's like harming other people or either oneself. So suffering, that is the own suffering or other people's suffering. So that's met with others in this case, that it's out of the norm as in terms of the behavior, and that so it's not something you develop overnight and then you have it for a week and it's gone. And it's quite persistent also in different areas of the life. So it filters in. It's not only showing in your relationship or only at work, it will show in all the different areas of your life. And so all these criteria are fulfilled for somebody who's high on psychopathy, but it's not a disorder listed in the DSM. So some ways we could say it's not a disorder. And so that's another reason for me to try to stay away from the psychopath. And yet another one is that overall we try to really use less labeling language. And that's also luckily a very good, strong push by the APA, the American Psychological Association, and Psychiatric Association as well, to use less labeling language, as in person first language preferred. So that would be a person who has high psychopathic traits rather than saying a psychopath.
And what would be the prevalence of people who are high in these traits?
Very good question. Well, it depends where you go. So most of the research has been done in prisons. And so we know most about rates or prevalence rates from this context. And there it's because it's not a diagnosis, right? So the way that it's measured is with some clinical expert rating tool. The most common one is the PCLR, the psychopathy checklist. And if you use a cutoff score there to qualify somebody as being high versus not on psychopathy, the prevalence rate in prisons for men is about 15 to 17%. And that's mainly data from the US, but also from other countries around the world. And it seems quite consistent. In women, it's a little bit lower, but and also more various, depends a little bit on which type of prison you go to in terms of the length of the sentences. But other than that, it's kind of around that area. So it's 15 to 17%. If you go outside of prison and you cannot use a PCLR as a measurement for psychopathy, which is dependent on file records to actually make a call and rate those items on that scale, we are kind of mainly left with self-report measures. There are only a few other types of measures that would allow some sort of rating. Other than that, it's self-report measures, and there's no cutoff there. We couldn't say there's this amount or this prevalence based on that because there's no cutoff point or so. However, if people try to use other alternative measures and go to general population samples, they would report back things like 1 to 1.5% of the general population would be considered as highly psychopathic.
And I'm sure you would have spoken to a lot of these people in your clinical training. What was that like?
Yeah. A little bit less in the clinical training. It was more in my research, actually, with people in prison and in forensic hospitals that took part in our studies. And in order to do the studies, we needed to know their scores on psychopathy. So this measure actually includes an interview. So you talk with them a lot. So not only in the context of running an experiment where you show something on the screen or so. And this is quite an interesting experience to learn about how they describe themselves, how they behave in this interaction. And I would say I get a pretty quick sense of how high somebody would score on this on the psychopathy checklist in an interaction. I would always need to go back to files and also really do the rating very carefully, but you get a good sense of it. I think what is the most striking thing in men with psychopathy, high scores of psychopathy, is this manipulativeness and this very strong dependency of what their own goal is in this current situation. So when I go in there as a researcher and say, can you chat with me? I have a couple of questions. Can we talk about what your childhood was like? And then tell me more about your crimes. It's quite interesting to see how they react to that situation, because people who have committed crimes, and a lot of crimes, maybe they are very much institutionalized, almost like they know the system. They get questions like that all the time, but it's mainly from people who have a say about their release or about their sentencing. And so there's a very different context if a researcher comes in, right? And that's quite cool, because you can then see how, if they still want to show themselves in the best light or not. And I think this manipulativeness that sometimes comes through, as in trying to shock me as a female, especially a female young person coming in, when I was doing my PhD, for example. That is quite interesting, to see that how they try to create a fear reaction in me to just talking about crimes that they might not even have committed, but just to see how I would react. I think the key difference in comparison to other people is that when they talk about emotional experiences, when they talk to you about something that happened in their life, like they lost one of their relatives or somebody stole their car, they can talk about it. They can say what emotion that would be. They can say, I felt terrible or I felt very sad. But the thing is, as somebody on the other side of the table, I don't sense it. And I don't know if you had this moment where you were talking with somebody where they talk to you about an emotional event and you just don't feel it. It's very rare, because usually what happens is if somebody says that, they don't need to necessarily show a facial expression with it or so. I don't think it's necessarily that, but it's really this, you feel that emotional state that this person was in and that they're talking about, you feel that yourself. And in people high on psychopathy, that's definitely a very key special feature, I think, that this doesn't happen. And this is kind of this emotional detachment that we know about in those people. And that's probably, I think the most striking characteristic.
Going with that, with the emotional detachment, do you see it in other physiological measures as well? Or is it just a sense kind of thing?
Well, as the perceiving person on the other side, that would be actually a very good study to do, to measure the own physiological activity. But what we definitely know from a lot of research now is that people high on psychopathy would react less strongly with physiological reactivity to anything that is, mainly negative, but so threatening or fear-provoking. So where usually people react to are if you show a video that has like some horror scenarios or something that is very sad, where you usually see a reaction in peripheral physiological measures such as skin conductance, so the sweating that I mentioned before, or heart rate, or also in the facial muscles, sometimes not visible to the naked eye, but the muscles reacting still to that. And also in brain activity. So, for example, EEG are also measured with fMRI. So the reactivity to a sad facial reaction, the reaction to a sad facial expression can be way less intense in the brain as measured with the fMRI, for example, in people who are high on psychopathy. So there is a dampened reaction to specifically negative cues. And the main argument there being that this being basically the reason for not learning, for example, because we need to be able to react to something that is negative in the first place to then use that to learn something new. And so that's kind of the underlying mechanism that was thought of, like a reduced reactivity, in some ways also even smaller brain volumes in areas that are related to emotion processing. So that's mainly being for psychopathy, amygdala and the insula. In some ways, anterior cingulate cortex related to that, but that's much more like the interaction between some certain brain areas that are related to emotion processing, that the way that they talk to each other, the connectivity being different in people high on psychopathy.
Mm-hmm. And how do they react to reward? Is that quite normative or?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, that actually they react probably normative, if anything, maybe stronger. And there's some sort of reward proneness that they would self-report. So they are pretty keen on rewards. But there's an idea out there that people have brought up who study psychopathy in younger people, so in children and youth, where we don't speak about psychopathy, but about callous and unemotional traits. They argue that if you are in that state of you don't react much to strong negative stimuli from outside, you almost have a need to have a stronger stimulation to feel something. And so that this need for more stimulation then switches over into the sensation seeking and gaining a reward by something that is more intense. And so that's kind of this, you need more intensity of any emotional cue to make it through to you. And that's one of the ideas that came through from there.
Can you tell us more about the callous and emotional traits in children?
Yeah, sure. I don't study children myself, but we have amazing colleagues all over the globe who do that. And I was lucky enough to be able to work with some of them. psychopathy really is a term that we try to use only from age 18, so in adults, basically. However, apart from that, we know that people don't turn into highly psychopathic individuals from the day of their birthday when they turn 18. So there was something before. We also know now that these traits that we would describe as this core of psychopathy, this callousness and low emotionality, starts quite early on. And people have found children at age 3 and 4 who show this callousness and meanness and really low emotionality, low empathy towards anybody, their siblings, their parents, other kids, super early on. And it's a trait that can disappear. So not every child who's callous and unemotional at age 4 and is maltreating animals and these sorts of things would be highly psychopathic when they are adult, but many of them do. So it is a precursor, as we call it, but it's not a given that somebody, a child with those traits would develop into somebody high on psychopathy, nor necessarily into somebody who commits crimes. There is a pathway to that, and it starts with that, but it's not a given. And we actually know also from a couple of good studies from, for example, Eva Kimonis over in Sydney and Luke Hyde over in the States, that the right treatment can actually help to reduce those traits over time. So it's not only like just waiting and some children just disappears, but also if you use some helpful treatment that is very comprehensive, includes family and not only the child, these traits can actually disappear.
What kind of treatments would that be?
So from those studies, it's just about learning how to read emotions from other people's facial expressions. It's not only about developing empathy by some sort of treatment for the child. These might feature in the treatment programs, but it actually has been found that these by themselves would not be effective. The treatment needs to include parent training. So one other kind of factor that contributes to the development of psychopathy is a harsh parenting and inconsistent parenting. And so it has to do a lot with parent training, as well as working with the children in their different contexts. So, for example, also in the school environment. And it's learning a whole lot of skills and abilities to find alternative ways to behave, basically.
Mm-hmm. So it's not inevitable for these children to become high on these traits?
No, yeah, definitely, yeah. And I think what is important for parents, also an important message for them, I mean, it's really hard with such a child, and it's a really important message to put out there. It's possible to do something. It's a lot of work, but it's really, really possible.
And how do you distinguish those children from other children who may have other behavioral issues?
Good question, yeah. Some children have just, again in quotes, just conduct problems, or oppositional defiant disorder is it when they are younger. But that's more the behavioral side. So in adults, when we think about those people high on psychopathy, they show those personality traits. They're low on empathy, low on emotion processing, manipulative, egocentric. And then they have these behavioral components where they actually show parasitic lifestyle, as it's called in the PCLR, which is like living of other people, basically not paying back what they borrowed and being aggressive and violent and impulsive. And so these two kind of aspects of psychopathy, if you want to look at that in the child, that the equivalent would be callous and emotional traits being this personality side, and these behavioral problems being this conduct disorder or conduct problem side. And so you can have both of them by themselves or together. And so children with only behavioral problems, these behavioral problems can disappear or not. And so those children who would be high on conduct problems without those callous and emotional traits, they have a quite high risk to develop antisocial personality disorder later. So show criminal behavior later. Similar to the callous and emotional traits being a precursor for the core personality aspect of psychopathy.
Yeah, I think a good segue is, how do you distinguish psychopathy from antisocial personality disorder? And one that I hear about a lot is sociopathy?
Yes. So apart from that, antisocial personality disorder is a DSM classified disorder. which is not equivalent to psychopathy, but it's what came out to be in the DSM when they tried to get psychopathy into the DSM. And that happened because some of these criteria and characteristics of psychopathy, and if you recall what I said earlier about this gut feeling that you have as the person on the other side, when they're talking about emotion, you don't feel it. That's so difficult to measure. So a lot of these criteria and the superficial charm, for example, these are all characteristics of psychopathy that are really difficult to grasp. And so they didn't make it into the DSM. So what ended up being there are all these other characteristics of psychopathy that are not so fluffy to measure. And that's basically the antisocial personality disorder. So just very much behavior-driven, behavior-related. It's a personality disorder that's characterized by early behavioral problems before age of 12, juvenile delinquency, ignoring rules and rights of other people, all this, the behavioral impulsive side of psychopathy, basically. So that's what antisocial personality disorder is. Somebody who's high on psychopathy can also have an antisocial personality disorder, but does not have to, and the other way around. They are overlapping, but they're not the same. And the sociopath question, that's something that it's a term that has been around for a while. It has never been a term in the scientific literature for cases where somebody hasn't had this long history from early childhood on or from childhood onwards of low emotionality and antisociality, but developed that more like suddenly later in life. So what sometimes people call acquired psychopathy could be sociopathy. And there are some examples out there where people had brain injuries, for example, that led to some sort of characteristics that are similar to psychopathy. However, sociopathy is not defined as that, but that's a context where it has been used in the past.
Ooh, I'm going to ask you a question because we're talking about misconceptions. There is this misconception that people who score high on psychopathy are like CEOs and are pretty successful.
Well, not necessarily all of them. So we have done a bit of research on this and found, interestingly, that it's almost like two things in a person high on psychopathy, two traits are pulling in opposite directions. So if you imagine somebody being very cold-hearted and like low on empathy, that you can imagine, well, that might be actually a handy characteristic for somebody who wants to be successful, to be able to, disengage from, be able to make decisions that are advantageous for them or their company, mainly for them, maybe, but care less about how it affects other people. You could imagine how that might be actually handy to be less impressed and less shocked, less reactive to other people's emotions. Might be handy. However, there's another aspect of psychopathy, and this is this impulsive manipulativeness that is so, it's more the impulsivity, really, and antisociality, where somebody has really trouble to follow a plan through long term. And these traits seem to be actually negatively related to success. So in 2 studies that we did so far, we could show that people who are higher on this fearlessness component, so this fearless dominance component, which is this personality component where it's about manipulating others and ignoring other people's emotions and not reacting to fearful cues and things like that. So these traits are positively linked to success, while the other traits, which are also part of psychopathy, even if they seem so opposite, then they're part of psychopathy. The impulsivity traits, they are negatively linked. So if you have somebody who's high on both, who fulfills the full picture of psychopathy, their success is not related to it, because if you have a positive correlation on one side and a negative correlation on the other side, they cancel each other out. And so there's nothing left. And that was basically for a long time the research finding that, well, sometimes it's related a little bit, sometimes not. And the moment that we started to disentangle these different aspects of psychopathy, we actually figured, well, there's one part that would pull in this success direction, but there's this other part that actually does hold them back from being really successful long term.
And do you have any advice for dealing with these kinds of people?
Well, I don't want to say stay away from them, because that would be very sad for people who have psychopathy, right? Because they would probably not have a lot of social life anymore. It's hard. So if you feeling like you are a victim of somebody with psychopathy as a partner, as a colleague, and you feel the detrimental effects of somebody who's bullying you and who's extremely mean and low empathic in the everyday interaction, that's not good for you. So the probably best way is to disengage from that relationship, whatever type of relationship it is. If you're a parent, you cannot disengage that easily from your child. So there's some other constellations where you really want to work on it. And I do know that there are people who are high on psychopathy who actually want to change and want to make a change in their life. That's probably not the classical picture book kind of ones, because most people high on psychopathy don't care so much about what effects they have on others. And they actually don't think that they are the problem. It's the others. So they would say, sure, you should get treatment, not me. You need to change. You need to be able to deal with me or with yourself. And so that can be quite challenging. Having said that, there are definitely people who, as I said, high on psychopathy, who want to change and want to seek treatment. And actually for them, it's quite hard to find somebody because there's not many people who would accept them for treatment.
Yep. Do a lot of these people have families as well? Can they maintain those bonds?
So if you go back to the classical way of measuring psychopathy with the PCLR, that's one of the criteria is basically short-term relationships. So they don't oftentimes have very long-lasting relationships. Some of them do. So I would never say everybody who's high on psychopathy cannot have a long-time relationship. But there is a lot of change and there's a lot of disengagement from an impulsive change between partners and also not good care for their children. So this is this irresponsibility, not caring for partners, children, and such.
I want to get into the actual biological side of it a little bit because you mentioned EEGs and also a few brain regions. So could you talk us through your research in that?
Yeah, absolutely. When I said earlier that there is what we know about psychopathy, there is a difference in the way that people who have psychopathy react to any negative cue that we see in the brain activity. So this is just like purely somebody watching a sad facial expression, a scenario of somebody being mutilated or anything like negative. Their response, the brain activity response, is just lower in comparison to others.
By lower, you mean just the same wave activity doesn't happen, or how do you measure something being lower?
Yes. So for example, one study that we've done with the EEG is we showed facial expressions, so fearful facial expressions and angry facial expressions and happy facial expressions, just like pictures of people smiling, frowning, and having eyes wide open for being afraid. And measured EEG. So the EEG is this measurement where you put a whole bunch of electrodes or sensors on the head, on the scalp, and it measures on the scalp the electrical activity that comes from the brain. So it's a measurement that gives us a very good time resolution. So we can be pretty exact in terms of the timing of the brain reacting to something. But it doesn't give us a very good spatial resolution or less good spatial resolution. So we don't necessarily know where totally exactly in the brain because it's sitting. So the cap and these sensors are sitting on the scalp and just measuring on the scalp the electrical activity, which of course is produced somewhere in the brain. And what you measure on the scalp is the concert basically of all the brain neurons reacting all over the brain. And what we found with this type of measurement, which allows us to be very, very exact about early processing stages in comparison to fMRI, where the hemodynamic bold response takes about a second until, it's a slowed down kind of way of measuring the brain activity. We would know better where exactly it is because we can see that in the scans. But the EEG allows us really on the millisecond basis to see reactions, for example, to those facial expressions. So what you usually see when you yourself put EEG cap on now, and you would look at my face or at a face on the screen, what you would show is, first of all, a super early component. What we call component is the activity that is indicative of facial expressions and items that are very, very important in our lives. So it's sometimes called the face component. It's happening already 170 milliseconds right after you see a face, for example. It's a little bit moderated by if it's a positive or negative one, but that's a very clear component. And after that, there is a phase where you can see another component that is related to arousal. And then later on, you have different other components that are related to where you actually encoded the positive or negative valence. And even later stages, more of those components differentiating the type of stimulus that you're looking at. So what we did is we showed these facial expressions to women who have committed crimes, and we did the PCLR checklist and had groups higher and lower on those checklists. And what we found is that this first component, just identifying that there's a facial expression, was the same. There was no difference between groups. Also, in the later stages, there were not really any differences there in the processing of these fearful, angry, and happy facial expressions. But in this phase in between, where it's only 200 to 300 milliseconds after this face comes up, that seems to really encode something that has to do with arousal. So this emotional response. We actually found differences there, and only for angry and fearful facial expressions, not for happy facial expressions. And what we found is a difference, as in those higher in psychopathy showed a less pronounced component. And so when we say that, what we mean with less reaction, it's most often time, it's not like there's a no reaction or so in comparison to those lower in psychopathy. It's just less pronounced. And what we kind of concluded from that study, for example, is that it's not so much something that it's in this long processing of whatever it is we look at. If there is somebody angry at looking at us or fearful, there's all sorts of things going on in our head, right? We're processing this just what it looks like. And then there's all these other things like, why might they be angry at us? Do I need to be getting afraid as well? Because there's maybe something around that I need to take care of as well. So there's a lot of processing going on. But in these later stages, we don't really see a lot of differences. And it seems to be that this spontaneous, super early reactions that are still not, it's not about recognizing a face. So this is intact, right? But it's these early processing stages where we figure out, is this something important or not, basically. And that's where we found these differences. And that's quite interesting because there's a lot of question marks around how this emotion processing can be affected in people with high on psychopathy. And at the same time, they're so manipulative. So how can that be that somebody who is really manipulative, where you actually need to understand other people's emotions, can be at the same time not good in understanding emotion? That doesn't really make any sense. And so I think the reason there is really that it's in these early moments of processing that there's a difference going on. And then later on, there's all sorts of compensatory mechanisms. And there's a nice fMRI study that actually shows that, where it's about this connectivity with what I talked about earlier between frontal cortex, so the area in the front of the brain, and limbic area, so like the amygdala, for example, that the connectivity or the way that these brain regions talk to each other, that is actually where it's different. And these things are happening from early on, but also they are they can deal with that potential lack of a spontaneous emotional response.
Can you go over what these brain areas are related to for the people that don't know?
Yeah, sure. So the ones that I mentioned at the beginning already, that this amygdala and insula and are part of the limbic system. So that's kind of the areas in the brain that are below the neocortex, deep inside the brain. And they're related to emotion processing. They also have a key function in fear processing and negative emotion processing. They're also relevant for positive emotions, but probably a little bit less so. And the prefrontal cortex that I mentioned is the lobe that is just right below our forefront. Forefront? Is it forefront?
Forehead?
Forehead. Forefront. So the prefrontal cortex right at the forehead behind the skull there. That's the area that contributes to, sometimes people call it almost like a controlling function of the limbic system. And it has to do with controlling behavior. It has to do with decision making and basically keeping our impulsivity at bay. So keeping us not doing things that we shouldn't do. Yeah. And so these need to talk to each other for that reason. And well, all brain regions need to talk to each other.
Is there any research looking at EEGs or whatever while someone with high psychopathy is trying to manipulate someone?
Very good question. There are studies where people have investigated, for example, lying or the ability to lie, and people high in psychopathy are pretty good liars. Also in those studies, they're very good in deceiving others. There is no study, to my knowledge, that used EEG for that. So there's definitely physiological measures with that. So Bruno Fischer in the University of Amsterdam, they have done work on this. And so people high on psychopathy are really good in lying and deceiving others, for sure. And they show less physiological response to in that context. So they have less problems doing that.
We have listeners who study a variety of things, including law. So I was wondering, how does it play out if you have, say, a defendant who has been categorized as high in psychopathy?
Yeah, well, so that depends on the jurisdiction where you are. So in New Zealand, it wouldn't play much of a role other than later in the game, potentially when it's about making decisions for earlier release or something like that. Because it's psychopathy is associated with high recidivism rate. If you have a score high on that, the chances might be lower because you would have a higher risk profile. But at the time of the trial in the first place, in New Zealand, it wouldn't play much of a role. It wouldn't be like for example, for the insanity defense or anything like that. In other parts of the world, so in the US, for example, scoring high on psychopathy can be the needle that switches over to death penalty, which is quite detrimental. And in yet other parts of the world, so Germany, the jurisdiction that I also am probably most familiar with, it did not play a role for most times. There was a phase where it was considered to be a reason for not insanity defense, but so people can be considered guilty, but then not responsible or less responsible for their actions. So they would be considered guilty and they would be sentenced, but because of this reduced responsibility, not get a full sentence, but like a small sentence, but then also a treatment order. And in that context, the treatment order is not time limited. It's on as long as somebody is dangerous for the society, and they can only be, and that's going to be looked at every year. So every year it's going to be assessed if that person is still dangerous for society. And so somebody high on psychopathy in that context and in this time frame where that was considered to be potentially a responsibility reducing factor, people would have a hard time getting out of those treatment facilities. At some point, it was basically the judges decided to not go down that route anymore that much. Also, the expert witnesses, so most often psychiatrists, were not oftentimes recommending that because the treatment, we just don't know enough about good treatment for adults with high psychopathic traits because there hasn't been proper and enough research on it. People have given up on that early on, and they thought it's like we can't deal with that. They can't change. They're going to be always very dangerous people, and so for that reason, a treatment order is kind of difficult because they would probably be in a treatment context forever. And that's actually what happened, and it also caused significant issues in the context of the treatment facility. So unless you have another mental health condition that would cause a reduced responsibility. That can be a sexual preference disorder or schizophrenia or any other mental health condition. Unless you have one of those, you would not be considered less responsible anymore in Germany now.
Yeah, should we get back to what you're actually doing now? Because we started at the beginning, but we never actually got to it.
Yes, yeah. I started out with a study that actually sparked my interest in the first place. Well, what I'm really keen on figuring out is if there's a link between this emotion processing deficit and, as we call it, reduced reaction to emotional cues. If that is actually the cause, as in causal, if there's a causal link between that and the antisocial behavior, or if that's not the causal link itself, and if it's more about the motivation in people high on psychopathy. Because there's quite a lot of research that shows people high in psychopathy, they can react. These brain areas that I mentioned before that react to emotional cues, it's not that they're not active at all. They can show reactions there. If you give somebody high in psychopathy the task to increase their emotional involvement with a picture that you show them, they're totally able to do that. And they show the same brain activity as others. So it's not that this brain area doesn't work. It's not that they are not able to do it. They are able to train also their brain to increase activity in certain areas. The area of research in this context moves towards this question, does it have something to do with motivation? So what are people high in psychopathy actually motivated for? Maybe they're just motivated to do something else, just not pay attention. And they're really good in focusing on their own motivation and ignoring other side effects around them. So things that happen around them that would usually distract us from our own motivation because we care, because we are shocked when we see somebody crying or we see that somebody is running away in fear. So we pay attention to that. Our brain is wired to pay attention to that. And we empathize with those. So seeing somebody falling down a flight of stairs in front of us creates an empathic response and also a physiological response. All of that is going on in us. And so it's not that in highly psychopathic individuals that wouldn't happen. It's just that if they have something else on their agenda in that moment, it doesn't. Mm-hmm. And so they can actually more easily phase out of these or not even phase in. That's these early processing stages. They just don't happen. And it's quite an interesting phenomenon that how our brain usually works. So we pay attention to emotional cues and we get distracted by them, which is oftentimes important and relevant. Sometimes it's not great getting distracted by the nice music that we hear outside when we're supposed to study or do something else. But at the core, it's important that we have that feature that we get distracted, but they don't. And in some contexts, you can imagine how that is an advantage. You can really better focus on things. You get less distracted. But in many other contexts, you miss out on these other things that are happening that you could respond to or should respond, or you're expected to respond to as from our society. And so understanding how these things relate, where's that motivation come from, and how can people change that motivation, or how can we help them develop motivation for things that they're probably not primarily interested in every given moment. So this is something we're really keen on figuring out in using empathy tasks where we ask people, how do you feel, or do you feel the same way as this person, and measure physiological responding and want to find out then if we would help them train to change this emotional arousal, if that would then change their behavior. Does somebody who has been learning and training to increase their emotional response, do they then behave differently in a task that asks for pro-social or antisocial behavior?
So they have the capacity to empathize, but they just choose not to.
Yeah.
So how far along are you in this research? I mean, like how far in these particular set of studies, how far along have you gotten?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think science never ends. And so I actually don't want to find an answer at some point because it would be boring. There's never a finite answer anyways. So I think we're in some ways at the beginning because we just do the switching from, we think that there's generally something wrong with emotion processing and reaction. I think we're moving out of that into this, it's context dependent, it's motivation dependent. And there might be even something like people on high in psychopathy, they might just enjoy fear, which people are just starting to investigate. Maybe it's not about like not reacting to that. They actually might like that. And for that reason that I mentioned earlier, like if you're very low on arousal overall, you're just seeking that. And so there might be some joy to something that is actually frightening others. I think there's still so many open questions. And we, in many of these studies, the empathy research, for example, like how people on psychopathy vary in different types of empathy, like cognitive, affective empathy. There's been done some work, and I think we're getting a sense of that there. But the ability to change emotional arousal and what effect that has on behavior, I think we're just very at the beginning.
Do you think it's a difficult area to work in if these people don't have the motivation to change?
Yeah, definitely. And as I said, when you asked earlier about people wanting treatment, it's probably not a given that every person who's high in psychopathy wants to change. And usually humans are pretty simple. The moment that we run into issues, we want to change because we run into issues. This approach motivation of like, I want to change to do something else. That's kind of the key thing I need to tackle. And it can't be like you want to be less imprisoned because that hasn't worked in the past.
There is a joke, which is how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? One, but the light bulb must want to change first.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Very much. That is a key component in there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But on that note, shall we move on to the set of rapid fire questions?
Yeah.
We don't have a sponsor for the segment yet or a name, but maybe you can help us.
Yeah.
Maybe we should have we should have measured your EEG while doing it as well. But
True.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that would be interesting.
Anyway.
Yeah. Okay. And there's no wrong answer.
Okay.
Summer or winter?
Winter.
Movies or TV series?
Movies.
If your life were a movie or TV series, what genre would it belong to?
Probably action.
Morning, noon, or night?
Morning.
Outdoors or indoors?
Outdoors.
Cats or dogs?
Dogs.
Which is heavier, a ton of feathers or a ton of steel?
I'm not going to answer that.
Right. What's your weapon of choice?
I don't want ever use any weapon. No weapon.
Very peaceful. Which superpower would you have?
I would love to be able to change people's minds.
That's cool. Is a hot dog a sandwich?
Nope.
What is your least favorite type of music?
Interesting question. It's probably something like this dark heavy metal where it's like roaring. No, you cannot even hear the voice, and they're like...
Isn't Germany known for dark metal?
Yes, that doesn't mean that I like it particularly.
What is your favorite food or cuisine?
Mediterranean.
What is the ugliest fruit or vegetable?
Not the ugly fruit. But I cannot think of an ugly. I love fruit and vegetable. I cannot think of something that's ugly. I'm not a huge potato fan, but...
Fair enough.
Banana. Yes, there we go. Banana.
Yeah, bananas.
I don't like banana.
Oh, they're classic.
It's not ugly, but...
All right. If you could be any animal, what animal would you be?
I would love to be an owl. Yeah, being able to fly. And then being this patient, observant character that in the moment that it needs to be there, it's active and going for whatever it needs to.
What is the worst thing you've paid money for?
Yes, I became a victim of a scam ordering shoes, 5 fingers, that then didn't come. And I still haven't seen the money back. Yeah.
Oh.
Since you were speaking about psychopathy, what ridiculous thing has someone tricked you into believing?
Many things. I think I'm not so good in lie detection. But in the context of the research, definitely, I will never forget that one participant in the study who told me about this horrendous crime that they committed involving several people dying. And I went back after that because I didn't read the file records before. That's what I usually do. I go back there later and I went back and it was just not true.
If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be?
In New Zealand.
Nice.
What is your version of there are 2 types of people in this world?
Oh, maybe. I mean, I'm a personality researcher, so per definition, they are not only 2 type of people in the world. Can't be. Doesn't exist. There are no 2 people who are the same. That's actually my answer.
Damn.
If you had to make a reality TV show, what would it be?
Oh my God. Yes. Academic life.
Would it have enough drama?
Not only.
Yeah.
But things that probably students sometimes don't know what happens as well, because the university is not only what happens in the lecture theater. There's a whole bunch of other things that happen there as well.
Mm-hmm.
I know already somebody who's going to write the plot.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, stay tuned for that.
Mm-hmm.
What's legal but still feels illegal?
Many things. Wasting food. Consuming more energy than needed.
Okay, if you were not doing this, what would you be doing?
Well, if I'm also not a clinical psychologist, which is probably too close because that would be one alternative, I would either have a bakery cafe kind of thing, or would be doing music therapy with people, which is also still very psychology-like. But
what type of researcher is most likely to win a drinking contest, and why is it a forensic researcher?
There's a lot of them out there. There's a list. Forensic psychologists maybe as well, but for forensic psychiatrists for sure are strong drinkers. I'm not going to give names.
Is there any reason for that?
Well, I think is in this area oftentimes, especially when it comes to this court expertise kind of area where it's all about making these calls about responsibility and insanity and dealing and predicting if somebody will commit crimes again. It's kind of hard stuff. I mean, you need to kind of really be able to do with that. And unfortunately, some people deal with that with drinking, which I think is not a great idea.
Okay, the very last thing. If you could give us one piece of advice to leave us with, what would that be?
As general life advice?
General life advice.
Keep being curious.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that. Thanks for coming on. If anybody listening wants to reach out to you, how can they get a hold of you and your research team?
So we have a webpage that's AFCRIN Lab, so our Affective and Criminal Neuroscience Labs abbreviation, AFCRIN lab.weebly.com. I'm also on Twitter only for research. So with the Twitter handle H_Eisenbarth. And if you're in Wellington, stop by at Vic Books at Calburn campus and let's have a chat.
Easy.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. That was really fun. Thank you.
And thanks everyone for listening. Join us next time. Until then, you can find us on Instagram at the Smooth Brain Society. We're on Facebook as well. And keep being curious. Bye.